Now, we proceed to the final components of today's session, which will be taken up by Professor Stefan Higgelson, titled Early African Engagements with the Problem of History. I invite Professor Higgelson to begin.
Thank you very much. I'm just wondering, I mean, this is a very tight schedule for you. Perhaps you need a 10-minute breather before we begin. What do you say, Viva?
Yeah. They can take 2-3 minutes. We can
Yes. So
at least 2-3 minutes.
We can begin at 22 your time.
It's
That's in
7:34
6
right
minutes.
now.
Yes.
7:34
Okay.
right now.
There's even so
No.
let's say we begin at a quarter to your time.
Yes.
So that gives people time. Okay. So in the meantime, could someone just make it possible for me to share my screen, because I think I've solved the problem from yesterday.
Yes, sir, we are presenting your slides. We will present, sir.
Right. So let me just test this. This really is a bit peculiar. Let me hang on. Just try once again. Yeah, I think it'll work this time, actually. This is just me testing now.
We can't see your screen as yet.
Okay. Wonder why.
Now we can see. Now we can see. Yeah, it's working.
It's working, and then I just want to see what happens if I turn on that. Do you see the full screen now? No, it's not going to. No, okay. I think we'll just do it the way we did yesterday. So I will stop sharing there, and then you can share those slides I sent.
Yes, sir, we are presenting.
Okay, so you can present the way we did yesterday. Right, that should be.
Is it okay, sir?
That should be correct. Yes, because.
Okay, sir.
Yeah. Okay, so we'll begin in a few minutes' time.
For sure, sir.
Yeah.
7:44 now. We can just one more minute to go.
That's fine. Right, should we begin?
Yes, sir, you can.
Fine. So you can go to the next slide. And welcome then to today's lecture. I understand that you have a very compressed schedule, and it is getting late in India. So I will do my best to keep this interesting. But here are the main components of today's lecture. First, I'll be speaking generally about modern African literary history, just to give you some background. Since I don't know you personally, some of you might be long-time scholars of African literature, and for others, it's a relatively new field. So my apologies if what I have to say can seem elementary, but I think it helps to provide that background for the rest of my lecture. And then I have three different examples, two of them from South Africa, two writers, Thomas Mofolo and Sol Plaatje, or Solomon Plaatje, and the two novels for which they are famous. And then the Nigerian example, Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, a novel you no doubt will be familiar with already. And then I have some closing remarks on how to reflect on fiction as history in Africa, given what we talked about yesterday in my lecture then. Next slide. So here's a map of Africa, and I think the first thing to be aware of is that Africa is very, very big. It is literally about 10 times the size of India. And India itself, as we know, is a very large country. So Africa is huge, and it is always very questionable to speak of Africa in general. I mean, this is a continent that is extremely diverse, with some 53 or 54 countries, literally thousands of languages, and extremely different cultures. So we need to cut this down to size, and first by reflecting on what literature in Africa can mean. It can mean a whole range of different things. We could refer to oral poetry and performance, songs, manuscript cultures, print literature, texts on social media, and so on. And all of this in hundreds of languages, and much of it ancient. An example of really ancient literature is the Ethiopian literature in that dates back to the first centuries of the Common Era. And I'm just noting there a book, Karen Barber's The Anthropology of Text, Persons, and Publics, which is actually very helpful if you want to reflect more on the diversity of literature in Africa and different approaches to it. Next slide, please. So my competence here is extremely limited. What I can talk about is really printed African literature from the modern era, and literature that is either written or translated into one of the three formerly colonial languages I can read: English, French, and Portuguese. So from that very wide scope, you have a very narrow range that I can say anything about. Then again, there is much that happens within that narrow range of literature. Next slide, please. No, next slide.
So I get there's a reflection problem.
Yeah. Okay. No, I see it now. So here I'm also just giving you an idea of which regions I will be discussing in today's lecture and the following days. So today the regions circled in red, that's Nigeria and South Africa, and then we have East Africa circled in purple there, which we will touch upon when looking at Abdul Razak Gurner's work. Next slide, please. Now I'm I'm returning to this statement by Simon Gikandi that I mentioned yesterday, where he says that modern African literature, and here he really is referring precisely to the print literature that I'm talking about, was produced in the crucible of colonialism. What this means, among other things, is that the men and women who founded the tradition of what we now call modern African writing, both in European and indigenous languages, were, without exception, products of the institutions that colonialism had introduced and developed in the continent. So there is, shall we say, a foundational problem or dilemma. It's a dilemma insofar as it is both enabling and constraining for these early print writers in Africa. They are shaped by colonialism, and at the same time need to find ways to resist that conditioning. Next slide, please. So historically, we can see that print cultures emerged mainly in southern and western Africa in the 19th century. Developments in East Africa came later. And in this development, there's a very strong missionary influence. It is almost hard to imagine today, but the impact of Christian, mainly Protestant missions in Africa from, shall we say, the 1830s, 40s until, well, really the mid 20th century was tremendous and had great consequences for the introduction of the Latin alphabet, the standardization of African languages, the access to resources such as printing presses for African writers and so on. Now, the missionaries, they obviously had their very, shall we say, limited interests and were mainly focused on producing and distributing devotional literature and periodicals. It is of some importance here to mention that an English classic text, Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan from the 17th century, became widely spread in Africa in about 80 different full or complete or partial translations into different African languages. This is just an example of how the missions could shape the incipient literary culture, because the Pilgrim's Progress subsequently became a very like a standard intertextual reference for many African writers. Now, it's of obvious importance that in this development, mission-educated Africans also began using print for their own purposes. And this is where interesting things start to happen. Next slide, please. So internationally, one can speak of a first breakthrough for African writers, really after the Second World War. So here are some standard references. You have this anthology of poetry edited by Leopold Senghor, poetry in French. We have Kamaralaye, West African writer, and his L'Enfant Noir, or The African Child. And Amos Tutuola from Nigeria, his book, The Palm Wine Drinker, which was published by Faber in London. So you could say, if there had been internal developments in Africa from the 19th century onwards, this is the moment when it also started to become visible in what were still the colonial metropolises of Paris and London. Next slide, please. So from 1945 onwards, things move quickly, and it's notable, for instance, that there were a number of congresses and conferences where African writers, intellectuals, activists gathered. And these have become almost legendary moments in subsequent sort of literary history. Within the Anglophone sphere, the conference at Makerere in Uganda, 1962, is often seen as sort of a watershed moment in the very definition of African literature. Next slide, please. And here I'm just mentioning a few examples of journals and publishers that formed the field. Now, Présence Africaine was a journal, it was actually also a publishing house. It's founded in 1947, based in Paris. Extremely significant in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. A slightly later development is the African Writers series. that existed for 4 decades and had a tremendous influence on shaping, in the English language, a canon of African literature. You see there the cover of Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart. Things Fall Apart was originally published in 1958, but it also was the first title to be published in the African Writers Series, 1962. And Achebe himself was, for a number of years in the 1960s, the commissioning editor of the African Writers Series. So his importance exceeds sort of his importance as a novelist, which is huge. But on top of that, he also exerted great influence on that moment of African literature, the 1960s moment. And then I'm also mentioning here Research in African Literatures, which is the premier journal in the field of African literary studies, and was founded as early as 1970. So all of these developments, the congresses, those early books, these journals and publishers, all of this sort of comes together to form a more or less coherent field of African literature in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and onwards. Next slide, please.
So we have already changed the slide, but I guess there's a reflection issue. So it is here.
There we go. There we go. That's fine. I understand that it takes. It's not a problem. Okay, so South Africa first, and then Nigeria. So here are just a few important dates in South African history, just to give you some kind of context. The map here is basically a colonial map. When South Africa belonged to the British Empire. There are some very direct connections between South African and Indian history, and we'll talk more about that, especially on Friday. But you have the obvious fact that the Portuguese were the first Europeans to travel around the Cape to India, or to Goa specifically. So there's an historical link there. And then we have sort of successive waves of colonization that really gather a significant impact from, shall we say, the mid-19th century onwards. And this is when the economic interest in colonizing what we today call South Africa grew rapidly, first with the discovery of diamonds in Kimberley, and then discovery of gold in Johannesburg, which was tremendously important. The two writers I'm going to talk about, Thomas Mofolo and Solomon Plaatje, they were shaped by events around the turn of the century, 1900. We have the South African War between the Boers and the British, which was an extremely violent war. It was, in many ways, the Vietnam War of its time, and the British had great difficulties to sort of manage the image of the British Empire, because the British were aggressors against a group of people who were white and identified as sort of Europeans in some sense. It was a tremendous upheaval, but ultimately it resulted in the formation of the Union of South Africa in 1910, and this is the moment when white supremacist rule is firmly established in South Africa, and in many ways the sort of precursor to what happens in 1948 when the system of apartheid was established. A subsequent important date, of course, is 1994, when finally democracy was won in South Africa. Okay, so that gives you some historical background. Next slide, please. So these then are the two writers I want to talk about, Thomas Mofolo and Solomon Plaatje. So both born the same year, as you can see. So they were young adults around the time of the South African War, and lived sort of well into the Union of South Africa. Next slide, please. Now, Thomas Mofolo, he worked as a journalist, editor and writer in the language known as Sesotho. It's a language spoken on the highlands of South Africa, central South Africa. And he himself was educated by French missionaries in mountainous Lesotho. He was the first novelist to write in the Sesotho language, and wrote 3 works, of which the last is his enduring legacy, and that's the book I'll be talking about shortly. Next slide, please. And then we have Solomon Plaatje, who was a remarkable figure in African history. An intellectual, an activist, a journalist, a writer, a translator. And one of the founders of the African National Congress, which became the sort of the national liberation movement, and has been in power ever since 1994. He spoke a slightly different language, Setswana. It's related to Sesotho, but it is distinct. And his among his works are, for instance, the reportage Native Life in South Africa, which is really about the consequences of what was known as the Natives Land Act, which was a draconian law imposed by the Union of South Africa, dispossessing Africans of the land, essentially. And this is a history that South Africa is still struggling with today. Tswana Proverbs, a fascinating book where he has collected a couple of hundred proverbs in Tswana, and then he provides both what he calls literal translations and equivalents. That's his term, equivalents from other languages. So he's doing something, doing like a transcultural experiment here with Tswana proverbs, and placing sort of Tswana culture on equal footing with other cultures. And then there's the novel I'll be talking about, Moody, and his translations of Shakespeare. He translated a number of Shakespeare plays into Setswana. Unfortunately, only a few remain, one or two. But Shakespeare was tremendously important to Solomon Pleike, and he saw Shakespeare, interestingly, as a fellow African. He could identify with what he read in the Shakespearean plays, and for that reason, he found it so important to translate Shakespeare into Setswana. Next slide, please. Right. So Thomas Mofolo's novel, then, Shaka, is an historical fiction, and so is Moody. So it's written around 1908, 1909, just as the Union of South Africa was forming. And at this moment, Mofolo decides to write a story about a very famous Zulu warrior king, Shaka. He is sometimes referred to as an emperor. He was, shall we say, a major African state maker, and is possibly the single most famous figure in South African history. Last year, there was a very successful South African TV series produced called Shaka Ilembe, and was a rendition of the story of Shaka, and there are many versions of this story. Now, what we meet in this novel is quite an extraordinary Faustian narrative about power. And when I say Faustian, I'm referring here really to the German writer Goethe's Faust, who sort of, in exchange for power, sells his soul to the devil. And we have a similar sort of mythical narrative here about Shaka. And it's a very dramatic trajectory. In the beginning of the story, the young boy Shaka is a bullied child, really excluded from society, but his military prowess and strength gradually turns him into a leader and eventually a feared ruler over many peoples in the region. This is today, shall we say, eastern South Africa. And then we also follow his inevitable fall. Next slide, please. So here's an example of how he sells his soul. A very important, purely fictional character in this novel is the doctor Isanusi, who has tremendous powers, and can sort of assist Shaka in shaping his destiny. But nothing comes sort of without a price. So here is Isanusi explaining to Shaka, in war, there would be none who could face him. The doctor said that the medicine which remained to be used was one which he did not have with him. He said it was a medicine associated with the spilling of blood, with killing. It is extremely evil, but it is also extremely good. Choose. The doctor placed matters in Shaka's hands. He told him, without hiding anything from him, that that medicine was truly evil. Then he, for his part, stood to one side, so that Shaka could act according to his wish. I want it, said Shaka. And now the final link has been cut. Shaka has deliberately chosen death instead of life. I actually get goosebumps when I read this quotation. It's what Shaka does here is what Mofolo does here is to place this character Shaka to confront the character Shaka with a moral choice. And I think that particular detail is very important. And I'll be returning to that, how Shaka actually is exercising his agency here. And he is, on the one hand, then choosing the path of evil or death and killing in such a way that he becomes an incomparably powerful ruler. In that way, exercising African agency and power. But at the same time, it comes at this terrible cost. Next slide, please. This is a moment where Shaka then is sort of at the height of his powers. After changing the national name, Shaka brought together the young men from Zwida's scattered nation, as well as those from nations that owed allegiance to him. And he said to them, "Today you have no king of your own anymore, nor are you any longer a nation." So he, interestingly, Shaka himself is portrayed by Mofolo as an empire builder. He destroys other nations so that they can be sort of incorporated in his rule, under his rule. Next slide, please. Now the single most sort of harrowing moment in the story, which is sort of consistent with Shaka's moral choice to choose the path of killing and violence, is when Shaka kills the one person he truly loves, and that is Noliwa. And here we see this sort of transformation of Shaka. After Noliwa's death, Shaka underwent a frightful change, both in his external appearance and also in his inner being, in his very heart. And so did his aims and his deeds. Firstly, the last spark of humanity still remaining in him was utterly and finally extinguished in the terrible darkness of his heart. His ability to distinguish between war and wanton killing or murder vanished without a trace, so that to him all these things were the same, and he regarded them in the same light. Secondly, his human nature died totally and irretrievably. Beast-like nature took possession of him. because although he had been a cruel person even before this, he had remained a human being. His cruelty, but a human weakness. So in the story, there's definitely a shift here. And I think this quotation also says something about sort of the narrator's own ambivalence towards Shaka, because a couple of chapters before this, there's a chapter that is really a celebration of all the achievements of Shaka, how he organized society and so on. But it is ultimately then a story about how power itself can corrupt. Next slide, please. The ending, these are the very last words of the novel. The ending is very interesting because we have then followed this narrative of Zulu King in the early 19th century, and it is a story that is sort of that occurs entirely within an African world. There aren't any colonizers in this world. There's a completely sort of African dynamic being played out here. And then we have this ending which is extremely mournful and somehow transports us back to the present moment in which Mofolo himself was writing this novel. And there it says, even to this very day, the Zulus, when they think how they were once a strong nation in the days of Shaka, and our other nations dreaded them so much that they could hardly swallow their food. And when they remember their kingdom which has fallen, tears well up in their eyes, and they say, they ferment, they curdle, even great pools dry away. Ka mateto, basically meaning that thus ends the story. So it's it's again one of these ambivalent moments where we have followed this dramatic story about Shaka, ultimately leading to his assassination by the hands of his brothers, and that's sort of part of the historical record. We followed that story, and at the same time, we then end up on this sort of mournful note, looking back nostalgically, really, on a moment when Africans ruled the country. But at the same time, it's these closing words serve a cautionary purpose, because it's as though they issue a warning to anyone who is in power, saying that, okay, your kingdom too can fall. It's a bit like Shelley's poem Ozymandias, which I'm sure many of you have read. They ferment, they curdle, even great pools dry away. Next slide, please. Okay, so that was Shaka, and then we have Plaiki and his novel Moody, which interestingly was written in English, and this is the first English language novel by an African writer in Southern Africa. It has a very different tone compared to Shaka, yet it is set in pretty much the same period, a bit later. I see I'm missing why they're in the early 19th century. I mentioned a term there, the Mfetane. It's used sometimes to refer to sort of the upheavals in Southern Africa that involved large-scale migrations of people, especially northwards, and that conventionally is associated with precisely Shaka's rule, the way he sort of crushed other rulers and in this way instigated certain groups to simply pack up and leave. So that's the Mfetane. Now, in this novel, Moody constructs the image of, shall we say, an alternative history. Remember now, this is written in 1920. We are 10 years into the Union of South Africa. Solomon Plaatje is making already a number of bitter experiences related to this this imposition of white rule. But here in this novel, he sort of constructs the image of an alternative history where conflicts among groups, including white settlers, could be resolved in favor of conviviality. And the female protagonist, Moody, is here sort of the locus of hope for such harmonious coexistence. Next slide, please. So I won't go into any greater length with Moody because of time constraints. But the crucial point here is that we have two novels where historical agency in these historical fictions, and I must emphasize that these are historical fictions, even as they draw upon actual events, where we can see that it's the Africans who have historical agency. And both can be described as narratives about the past that combine cultural pride in being African, with a critique of how power can be abused, regardless of who is in power. And this makes them very interesting to read. They're not in any way simplistic or simply activist or anything like that. They're doing something quite complicated. And both of these novels, in a tragic mode in Shaka and in a romantic mode in Moody, because Moody, you could say, ends really on a positive note, and it's very much this love story between Moody and Rataga that is at the center of the plot. But both of these novels, in these different modes, portray a world in rapid transformation, which, referring to terms I discussed yesterday, involves a sort of a growing gap between the space of experience and the horizon of expectation. We'll talk more about that towards that. Next slide, please. So then we come to Nigeria. And just very briefly, I mean, these days, this is the most populous country in Africa, with a huge number of different ethnic groups. I mean, some would count as many as 250. But there are arguably three dominant ethnic groups: the Yoruba, the Igbo, and the Hausa. The Hausa are in the north, the Igbo in the southeast, the Yoruba to the west. This is a part of Africa that has been the site of ancient civilizations. So it's very historical terrain in that sense. The impact of Islam was very significant, especially in what is today northern Nigeria. And there was also very deep involvement in the transatlantic slave trade in the 17th and 19th centuries. And this is a profoundly traumatic and ambiguous historical experience, because demand came from European slave traders. Supply came from local African rulers who collaborated with the European slave traders. And the people who suffered, who were wrenched from their homes and their livelihood, were of course local. So that history affected all of Western Africa, really, in terrible ways. And it's a specific sort of period, specifically brutal period, that is in many ways different, although not unrelated, to subsequent colonization, which actually happens late. The colonization of Africa generally was a very late phenomenon, late 19th century, excluding those outposts, typically coastal outposts, where there had been European presence ever since the 15th and 16th centuries. And then Nigeria became independent in 1960. As always with these colonial histories, I mean, the borders of Nigeria is really a fiction. It's a construct that has very little to do with the deeper history of this part of Africa. But these are the borders that are the ones that count these days. Okay, so that's Nigeria. Next slide, please. Chinua Achebe. If there's just one African writer that needs to be mentioned, it is obviously Chinua Achebe. And his novel, Things Fall Apart, is the preeminent African classic. I mean, it has been almost ridiculously successful. It is translated into, these days, I literally don't know how many languages, more than 50 languages, certainly. And has been sold in the millions. And was recognized almost from the moment of its publication as a significant novel. Very much a part of that early international breakthrough of African literature, but also, shall we say, so important that it sort of overshadows all other African literature from that period. Next slide, please. So he published a great deal. These are his novels. He also published essays, collection of poetry, collection of short stories. But these are his novels, and the first three. Next slide, please. The first three here are known often as the African trilogy. They do have the stories in these three do have an internal sort of connection. They don't follow fully chronologically, so Things Fall Apart is set in 19th century Igbo land. No Longer at Ease is set in what was then contemporary Nigeria, the 1950s. And then Arrow of God looks at the 1920s. But there are various connections between characters in these three novels. And I'll be referring to Things Fall Apart and eventually also to Arrow of God. Next slide, please. So I'm assuming now that many of you would have read Things Fall Apart, and it would be interesting to hear your reflections on that reading experience. But I'll just briefly run through some of the key aspects of the novel. It's set in this fictional village, Umuofia, in southeast Nigeria, and as you know, it focuses on this protagonist, Okonkwo, who I describe here as hypermasculine, and as you will know if you've read the novel, his strength and resolve is also his weakness. He is so unflinching and inflexible in his defense of traditional Igbo values that also brings about his downfall. Importantly, it's a novel written in English, and later Achebe would be sort of debating this with other African writers who would insist that African literature needs to be written in African literature. He defended his choice to write in English, saying that this itself is a what we today might call a decolonial gesture. He was making use of the English language for his own purposes and on behalf of its African perspective. Next slide, please. Now, the question I want you to keep in mind here, when we talk about the African perspective, and this applies to all three of the novels I'm talking about today, it's actually worth pausing what constitutes the African perspective. It's crucial not to think of this in simplistic ways, because when one looks a bit more closely at this novel, one could say that there are multiple African perspectives, and one could say that the African perspective is very ambiguous. Next slide, please. If you've read the novel, you will recognize that these are the closing words. And it's actually a novel that can be read from sort of back to front. The story of this man who had killed a messenger and hanged himself would make interesting reading. One could almost write a whole chapter on him. Perhaps not a whole chapter, but a reasonable paragraph at any rate. There was so much else to include, and one must be firm in cutting out details. He had already chosen the title of the book after much thought: The Pacification of the Primitive Tribes of the Lower Niger. So who's the he here? The he is the commissioner, the representative of British colonial rule, which is sort of imposed as we follow the story in Things Fall Apart. What's fascinating about the ending of Things Fall Apart is the very sudden way in which the perspective we've been following throughout the novel, which is really the life of the village Umuofia, is inverted just like that. And the story that we have been following is here reduced to the story of a man who'd killed a messenger and hanged himself. An extreme reduction of that story, because this is Okonkwo he's referring to. And it might sort of fit simply a paragraph in this book, which is a sort of preeminently colonial book. The title shows that it is intended to sort of celebrate the imposition of British colonial rule. So what happens here in this ending of Things Fall Apart is that Achebe himself profoundly sort of ironizes the story we have been reading. And demonstrates in this way the extreme epistemic violence to which Africa has been subjected. The sort of the erasure of Africans, of African agency, African subjectivity from really the history of Africa itself. So if one reads the novel from back to front, one gains a very keen understanding of what it is Achebe is trying to achieve in the rest of the novel. Next slide, please. Now, as we read the story, and you will have noticed then that the first half, or even 2/3, is very focused on sort of the internal social and cultural life of Umuofia. Even there, it's quite striking how the focalization, the perspective established by the narrator, is actually ambiguous. So I can just read a bit more from this section. This is in chapter 2. Darkness held a vague terror for these people, even the bravest among them. Children were warned not to whistle at night for fear of evil spirits. Dangerous animals became even more sinister and uncanny in the dark. The snake was never called by its name at night because it would hear. It was called a string. And so on this particular night, as the crier's voice was gradually swallowed up in the distance, silence returned to the world, a vibrant silence made more intense by the universal trill of a million forest insects. What is the narrator doing here? I mean, who is he explaining this for? What we encounter here is an intriguing and perhaps troubling shift sort of into, shall we say, an ethnographic mode, of writing whereby Achebe is adopting the perspective of an outsider for these people. And one way of reading this is that Achebe himself was shaped by this ambivalence. We must remember that this is an historical novel. It's a fiction about a period that Achebe himself had not experienced. And Achebe was educated within the British colonial framework. He was brought up as a Christian. So there's this interesting tension in the novel, which actually applies also, especially to Thomas Mofolo's Shaka. Next slide, please. Right. Now, I've been referring to Shaka as a tragedy, and Things Fall Apart is also definitely a tragedy. And I think here the Greek, the ancient Greek understanding of tragedy is actually very helpful in making sense of this tragic dimension, because what characterized the ancient Greek notion of tragedy was that it was about powerful protagonists, impressive protagonists, who sort of brought, who had a flaw, a character flaw. Hamartia is the Greek term. A character flaw that meant that they acted in such a way that they caused their own downfall. And this is what we find in Shaka, and it is also what we find in Things Fall Apart. And the most crucial and cruel moment in the novel has to do with this young boy, Ikemefuna, a young boy who Okonkwo adopts, comes from another village that has been in conflict with Umufuya, and it is a boy whom Okonkwo actually loves much more than his own son. That boy calls you father, do not bear a hand in his death. Okonkwo was surprised and was about to say something when the old man continued. Yes, Umufuya has decided to kill him. The Oracle of the Hills has pronounced it, but I want you to have nothing to do with it. He calls you father. This is a tremendously dramatic and painful moment, and one could even compare it to the Old Testament, where Abraham receives the command to kill his son. Isaac, and Okonkwo here, despite his love, decides to follow through on what sort of tradition ordains. So there's something similar here going on as in Shaka, where sort of Shaka sells his soul. Next slide, please. So dazed with fear, Okonkwo drew his machete and cut him, Ikemefuna, down. He was afraid of being thought weak. And psychologically, we understand this flaw and this fear in Okonkwo, because he is so ashamed of his own father, who he sees as a good-for-nothing, who never earned any honor on behalf of his family. And it's his fear of being compared to his own father that is sort of the what drives him to do what he does here. Next slide, please. It is also this extremely sort of dramatic development that occurs, again, entirely within the context of the African society, that also makes the imposition of the missionaries, because what Achebe does here in this novel is that he portrays the missionaries as the forerunners of colonialism, the forerunners of colonization. And he portrays them as themselves being not a homogeneous group. There is a soft version of the missionary colonizer and a hard version of the missionary colonizer. But it's not simply a matter of coercion, because we have then Okonkwo's son who listens to the converts and the missionaries and is moved by what he hears. The hymn about brothers who sat in darkness and in fear seemed to answer a vague and persistent question that haunted his young soul. The question of the twins crying in the bush and the question of Ikemefuna who was killed. The words of the hymn were like the drops of frozen rain melting on the dry palate of the panting earth. Neuer's callow mind was greatly puzzled. So there's some kind of receptivity to the message of the missionaries here that Achebe, interestingly, sort of integrates in this narrative. Next slide, please. So technically, I can make a handful of observations about how Achebe achieves what he does in the novel. I've spoken about this multiple and ambiguous focalization. I think we can also call it a syncretistic focalization. Syncretism is the term normally used to describe the blending, merging of different religious frameworks. And I think this is part of the explanation for this ambiguous focalization, that Achebe is shaped by Christianity and at the same time is very loyal towards indigenous tradition and ritual. Another very important technical feature, narratological feature of this novel is how on the one hand, we see how Achebe is really a masterly novelist and produces a novel that can be read sort of within the wider sort of global tradition of the novel, but he integrates Igbo genres and forms in this novel, parables, proverbs, rhetorical practices, and this is something one can look closer at if one wants to in sort of a closer reading, if we had more time to closely investigate the novel. We have words. You'll have noticed this. There are Igbo words that are also included, and then we have the way he makes the way he constructs. Sorry, not yet. The way he constructs the plot, which in temporal terms gradually accelerates. It would be interesting to know if this is your experience as well, but I would claim that from the later third onwards, the pace of the story increases dramatically and becomes sort of calamitous in that final chapter, where suddenly then the perspective is flipped, and we sort of read the perspective of the commissioner. And I think this is where the title, which is from a poem by forget by Yeats, The Second Coming, which reads, "Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world." And it's as though this widening and widening gyre is described by the plot, and things move faster and faster, uncontrollably. Next slide, please. So, referring to this term emplotment that we spoke about yesterday, Hayden White's term, this account of the past, as in Mofolo's Shaka, follows a tragic structure in which the agency of Africans is also involved in the colonial rupture. And this is quite a complicated point to make sense of, because it's not as though Achebe is saying that colonization was sort of the fault of Africans, but they are definitely involved in the colonial rupture, and there are sort of certain dynamics in Igbo society that get caught up in the historical imposition of colonialism. Next slide, please. And I think it's also crucial to recognize that this is a story that in no way is simplistic or just sort of binary in its setup, because it's also a story about how African society, in this instance Igbo society itself, had its conflicts, and people had disagreements, and at the same time these conflicts, there were customs, traditions, procedures that sort of handled those conflicts, and also made the Igbo society adaptable in important ways. And I suppose this lies at the heart of what Achebe himself often claimed to be the intention with these early novels of his, that he simply wanted to show that Africans themselves also had a culture. And I mean, these days it can seem inconceivable that even had to be proved, but this had directly to do with that epistemic violence, the sort of the discursive erasure of Africa from the very concept of history, as we discussed yesterday. Next slide, please. Here then is just a quotation from arguably Achebe's greatest masterpiece, Arrow of God, but I feel that it captures something essential in his narratives, in his refusal to simplify these fictions. The world is like a mask dancing, and this refers then to sort of a local ritual where someone would don a mask and sort of inhabit a persona that was the mask. So the world is like a mask dancing. If you want to see it well, you do not stand in one place. So there's something here about the dynamism, motion, multiple perspectives that I think speaks significantly to what Achebe achieves in these early novels. Next slide, please. So just some closing reflections then on fiction as history in Africa. I mean, yesterday we were talking about history as narrative and narrative as history, or fiction as history, and all of these three novels we've discussed now are definitely fictions. But at the same time, they deliberately engage with the past. And what happens then if we adopt these terms, space of experience and horizon of expectation, in our analysis? And in the case of Thomas Mofolo and Solomon Plaiki, who were of the same age and experienced the increasingly brutal imposition of white supremacist rule. And it should be remembered here that South Africa became a settler colony. Nigeria was never a settler colony, but South Africa was. And settler colonies, the histories of settler colonies are always the most bitter histories one can find. If we use these terms, space of experience and horizon of expectation, we can see how they were positioned in such a way that they definitely were experiencing a colonial present, but were deeply in touch and still shaped by an African past. But their horizon of expectation was problematic. It was essentially a European future, a white supremacist future that they were confronting. I think this in particular can account for the tragic mode of Mofolo's novel Shaka. It's a bit more complicated with Plaiki's Moody, because I mean it's in many ways a brighter novel than Shaka, and it's worth thinking about why that mood was different. Anyway, next slide. Then we have Achebe, who comes later, and if we recognize that this African trilogy was written and published in the 1950s, early 1960s, we have another sort of temporal dynamic. Here, the past was clearly shaped both by sort of an African past and a colonial past. As mentioned, Achebe himself was shaped by colonial education, by mission Christianity, and so on. And they appeared very much in a transitional present. So, I mean, as early as 1954, Nigeria gained a degree of self-rule, and in 1960 it gained full independence. So the horizon of expectation here for Achebe was significantly different. It was the expectation of a post-colonial future, an expectation that was rudely disrupted by the Biafra War in 1967, a war that really affected Achebe deeply, because he was in fact in favor of that secession of Biafra, which would have been like an Igbo nation. But at this moment, these three early novels are still sort of before the Biafra War. There was really a more optimistic horizon of expectation. And I suppose this optimism also allowed for the nuance that we find in his novels. Next slide, please. Another way of representing this temporal relationship is to try and think about how the fictional worlds, in this case of Shaka and Moody, sort of intersects with the historical moment in which the novels appear. And by and large, the fictional world is separate from the moment of white colonialism in early 20th century South Africa, requiring a degree of interpretation in order to see how they relate to that moment. However, there's a moment in Shaka that I didn't quote, but that's where at the moment of his assassination, Shaka tells his assassins that you think that you will rule after me, but you are mistaken, because the white man will take over and you will be his servants. So that's a moment where the novel sort of projects itself directly into this difficult moment in 20th century South Africa. Next slide. With Achebe's novels, it will be sort of slightly different. You have Things Fall Apart, which is definitely sort of separate from that transitional moment in which Achebe is writing. Arrow of God, it would require a long explanation to really make this evident, but it's basically set in the 1920s, so it's deeply sort of into the colonial moment. And then we have No Longer at Ease, which is set in 1950s Nigeria. So we can see here how if we take these three novels in conjunction, that there is a rather complex temporal relationship to the historical moment in which Achebe was writing. Next slide, please. Here I'm just reminding you of this quotation from Achille Mbembe's On the Post-Colony, where he speaks of the entanglement of multiple temporalities. And I believe one can make a case in all three of these novels for various kinds of temporal entanglement that in the first instance have to do with the ambivalent positioning of these writers themselves, shaped as they have been by colonial education, but wanting at the same time to wanting to retrieve African pasts. Next slide, please. Now you'll be receiving this, this PowerPoint. I'm just listing a few titles that could be of interest if you want to study South African and West African writing more deeply. These are just suggestions. I'm not going to explain at any length what they're about. And then next slide. So just to sum up, and I think we then will have time for questions, 10 or 15 minutes. What I've tried to demonstrate with these three writers as examples is that history was really a central stake for these early African writers, and that to return to my question yesterday, or my observation that for these early writers, that the question of African historical agency was very important and of great consequence. What we see in these novels is that the restitution of African agency in the fictions is it's definitely something that they do, but it's also very complex, and certainly in Shaka and Things Fall Apart, this restitution has a profoundly sort of tragic dimension. We can see an entanglement of temporalities, African, European, but also a kind of ongoing synchronization, which one could perhaps focus a bit more on also. And then these syncretistic tendencies I've spoken of, where both African and Christian beliefs are somehow fused or juxtaposed. So referring back to the point about how cultures can have different chronological orders, I think we encounter here more of a hybrid than a singular cultural ordering of time. What we see in Things Fall Apart is certainly how the agricultural traditions shape time. In Umofuia, the festival of the new yam, for instance, is of tremendous importance in marking time. But at the same time, we have these Christian elements that come to be taken up by inhabitants of Umofuia. So that pretty much wraps up what I have to say about these early African engagements with history. And we do have a few minutes for questions.
Thank you so much, sir. Participants can drop their queries in the chat box.
Very interesting, very fascinating discussion. We teach a lot of these, especially Chinua Achebe is very popular in India for obvious reasons. So I like the way you ended up saying that Yam festival is important documenting the temporality of a certain time. So that is very intriguing because uh, the idea of history also differs from continent to continent. I'm sure, obviously, we cannot generalize Africa as one culture, but uh, the idea of time and history are very different in different cultures, and festivals are a very nice, indications of those kinds of things. So, for in India, for example, it's very fascinating. Like according to the lunar calendar and the solar calendar, there are two calendars that run, and the Hindu festivals like Diwali and Holi, they all occur according to the harvests. These are all harvest celebrations. They go according to the climate, the climate, the weather cycle, the climate cycle. So just after the monsoon has wrapped up and everything is clear and the weather is good and all, so now we celebrate Diwali, the festival of lights, and that is the time when the winter starts. And then after a few months, there is spring and everything, and the winter is over. It's the arrival of summer, and harvest is arrived in our villages. So we have Holi. But in the English calendar, the Gregorian calendar, these dates keep shifting from here to there. And every 15 days or 10 days, sometimes Diwali is in March, Holi is in March or February or like that. So this is a very, you've made a very important observation here, because this tradition, this aspect of tradition of how we are keeping a, a mapping of time, and how we are mapping the history according to our concept of time is very intriguing, and that gives us a very beautiful intervention into works of African writers, Indian writers, especially African writers, because people like Wole Soyinka, they celebrate so much with festivals are there. In Dance of the Forest, you will see so many festivals. So thank you. This is a wonderful thing.
Thank you, Viva. Yes.
We have a
Um,
question in. Okay, sorry, you may continue.
right. So here's a question. Two questions.
Yes.
How can we examine oral cultural tradition or folklores as history? Because oral culture is the basis of tribal cultures in Africa and the world. Yes, that's a very central question, and I haven't really sort of addressed the tensions between print literature and orality. This has been a standard theme in African literary criticism. It was a constant theme in the 60s and 70s, when sort of orality was seen as the sort of the touchstone of authenticity in African literature. These days, I think we know a lot more about orality, and also the sort of constant traffic between orality and writing, orality and print, and I would refer once again to that book I mentioned at the beginning of my lecture, Karen Barber's The Anthropology of Texts, Persons, and Publics, which I think provides a very incisive and useful framework to make sense of orality also as really a form of textuality. And ultimately, of course, when we enter that domain, we need to be very humble in view of the tremendous linguistic pluralism of Africa. And it's actually not for me to say much more about that, because I can't access those local oral traditions. What I can access are sort of studies that have been done that I can read in English. But I think it is of importance today to recognize that what sometimes is called secondary orality, performances conveyed through social media, and also sort of variety of spoken word poetry. These are sort of the contemporary ways in which orality lives in Africa today, and can often be conveyed in a vehicular language such as English or French or Portuguese that one can understand in different parts of the continent. Okay, next question. Has enough documentation been done about the history of Africa? As was earlier mentioned, that Indian history is indeed not sufficiently documented, as African history also met the same fate. Well, yes and no. There's still so much that can be done and is being done in the field of African history or African histories. I think there's been significant methodological developments in recent decades, where, for instance, oral histories are included in how one makes sense of African pasts, and elements of oral traditions, such as epics. There are a wide range of African oral epics, the most famous being Sunjata in West Africa, are themselves also keys to understanding historical events and developments. So I think the point here is that documentation needs to be understood in a more capacious sense than in sort of traditional academic history. Documentation is not always about the written document, but there are a variety. There's a variety of different kinds of documents. Okay, next question. Can we say that these trends discussed with respect to South Africa, Nigeria, and Africa in general are also relevant in the context of East Africa, Zanzibar, and the text that represent the Zanzibari revolution? Yeah, well, it's a big question. I'll be returning to East Africa tomorrow. I can very briefly say that, especially with reference to Zanzibar, the historical context is different. We have the very old sort of Indian Ocean network, whereby there were traders moving from the Arab countries down along the east coast and across the Indian Ocean to India, meaning that Islam was a very profound influence on this part of the world, and you have a tradition of Islamic writing that is really that predates European colonialism. So in Swahili, the oldest texts are written in Arabic script, So that would be one way of answering a question, that there are differences. And Gurna himself, remarking on Achebe's Things Fall Apart, has said that the world presented in Things Fall Apart is completely different from what he lived in as a child on Zanzibar. Okay, should we wrap up there? This has been a long session for you, and
Yes,
I
yes.
admire. Hmm.
Okay, so thank you so much for a very engaging session. So with this, we conclude to day 2 with the Gyan courses. And a special thanks to Professor Anita Singh, Professor Vibha Sharma, and Professor Stephen Higginson, obviously, for their lectures, and to Dr. Sumit Kumar Sharma, teacher in charge of today's session. And the test link will be shared in the WhatsApp group. You may take the test in any time before midnight, but the placed time is 15 minutes once you start. So, okay, thank you all for the participation today, and we look forward to seeing you again tomorrow for the day 3, obviously.
We would have taken you around Aligarh town if you were in India at this moment, and
Yes, only wish. Hmm.
and a lot of assault on your digestive system would have been there with the spicy food. So you have been spared uh, from that, but that is always due.
Yes. Well, I look forward to a visit eventually, and I can tell you that I really appreciate the food I've had in India. So I think it's among the best one can find anyway.
Yeah, Aligarh has
Mm.
its own hospitality standards, a very fascinating culture of the campus. I'm sure someday you will make it here and you will enjoy all that. Ilva is
Yeah,
coming in April here, so she's been lucky that she got through with that 1 week. We are trying to
excellent.
facilitate all that, but I'm sure we'll definitely have some more opportunities. You know,
Right.
today's lecture was very, very fascinating. I learned a lot. It was, engaging for me also, and some of the things were definitely very fresh for me and really benefited a lot. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening. Mm.
All the participants, now you
Okay.
can go back and rest. We'll meet again tomorrow.
Mm.
Thank you so much.
See you tomorrow. Okay. Bye.
Bye. Bye.